What if the simple act of sharing your lunch with a stranger was actually a test that would change your entire life? What if the person you thought had nothing was observing everything, cataloging every gesture, every word, every moment of grace under impossible pressure? Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her daily ritual with an elderly man in a corner booth would lead to anything beyond a warm cup of coffee and a brief escape from her crushing debt. She saw a lonely stranger who couldn't afford breakfast. She shared what little she had because it felt right, because kindness was all she had left to give. But someone was watching. Someone was measuring. Someone was deciding whether she deserved what came next. And what came next would shatter everything she thought she knew about family, fortune, and the true cost of compassion. The ritual began simply enough, born from observation rather than obligation. Sarah arrived at Rosie's Diner every morning at 5:30. A full hour before her shift officially started. She used that time to prep the coffee station, wipe down tables still sticky from the night before, and ensure the corner booth, the one farthest from the door, with a cracked vinyl seat and view of the parking lot, was spotless. At exactly 6:45, the elderly man shuffled through the door. She learned his preferences through silent attention. He held his coffee cup with both hands, trembling fingers wrapped around the ceramic, as if drawing warmth from something beyond the liquid inside. So she made sure the temperature was precise, hot enough to comfort, cool enough that his unsteady grip wouldn't result in burns. He never touched the creamer Monica automatically placed on every table, so Sarah stopped bringing it. He took his coffee black, no sugar, no additions, just bitter and honest. The toast came next. 2 slices of wheat bread lightly buttered, not drenched, just enough to soften the edges, and cut diagonally. Always diagonally. Her mother had done it that way, claimed it made the bread taste better somehow. And Sarah found herself continuing the tradition without thinking. She'd set the plate down gently, refill his cup, and walk away before he could refuse or feel obligated to acknowledge the gesture. "You know he never tips, right?" Monica said one morning, watching Sarah prepare the toast with the care most people reserved for paying customers. Like, not even $1. Not once in 3 years. Sarah spread the butter evenly, her movements deliberate. "I know. And you're buying this from your own paycheck? Girl, you're broke. We're all broke. Why are you feeding someone who gives you nothing?" "Maybe that's exactly why," Sarah replied quietly. Monica rolled her eyes and walked away, muttering something about bleeding hearts and empty wallets. Brian, the manager, cornered Sarah during the lunch rush 2 weeks later. He was a compact man with perpetually tired eyes and the bearing of someone who'd given up on dreams years ago, but couldn't quite remember what they'd been. "Mitchell, we need to talk about your service distribution." Sarah wiped down the counter, already knowing where this was going. "Okay, the ghost in booth 7. You spend 15 minutes every morning on a customer who orders nothing, pays for nothing, tips nothing. That's prime breakfast real estate you're wasting on deadweight." "He's not deadweight. He's a person." Brian's expression flattened. "He's a loss. Every minute you spend there is a minute you're not turning tables, not generating revenue. I need you focused on customers who actually contribute to keeping this place open." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I'm focused. I'll make up the difference on my other tables." And she did. Sarah worked faster, smiled wider, absorbed the complaints and demands of customers who saw her as an extension of the furniture rather than a human being with her own crushing problems. She covered for coworkers who called in sick, stayed late when the night cook's arthritis flared, and never once complained about the extra load. But every morning at 6:45, she made sure the corner booth was ready, coffee black, toast cut diagonally, and a moment of acknowledgement that someone existed even when the rest of the world had decided he didn't. Slowly, incrementally, the old man began to thaw. First came the nod, just a small dip of his chin when she set down the coffee. Then, 3 months into their silent routine, he spoke. One word, barely audible. "Thanks." Sarah's heart lifted in a way she hadn't expected. "You're welcome." After that, fragments of conversation emerged like seeds pushing through concrete. He'd lost his wife 5 years ago. Cancer. He'd once owned a business, though he didn't specify what kind. He lived alone in an apartment somewhere nearby. And one morning, unprompted, he asked about her. "You seem tired," he observed, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah laughed, the sound hollow. "That obvious?" "You have dreams," he said, not quite a question. She found herself telling him about culinary school, about the acceptance letter she'd received and couldn't use, about her mother's illness and the debt that followed her like a shadow. She talked while refilling his coffee, while clearing nearby tables, filling the silence with confessions she hadn't shared with anyone else. "You should go," he said quietly, "to school. Don't let dreams die just because life gets hard." Sarah smiled, but it felt like a mask. "Dreams cost money I don't have." He nodded slowly, something unreadable flickering across his weathered features. Then he returned to his coffee and his window, and they didn't speak of it again. But Sarah noticed his gaze sharpening. He watched her more carefully now, observed how she handled difficult customers with grace, how she stayed late to help others, how she slipped extra food to a homeless man who wandered in asking for water. The old man saw everything, cataloging details Sarah didn't realize she was revealing. She had no idea she was being tested, no idea that every act of kindness was being weighed and measured against a standard she couldn't see. No idea that the ghost in the corner booth was deciding her future with the precision of a jeweler examining a stone. Sarah just knew that these 15 minutes every morning had become the anchor of her chaotic life. Everything else was drowning. But this small ritual of shared humanity felt real. Winter arrived with teeth bared and cruelty sharpened. The cold crept through the diner's walls like an unwelcome guest, finding every crack, every gap in the ancient insulation. The heating system wheezed and groaned, pushing out air that smelled faintly of burning dust, but did little to combat the chill. Customers huddled over their coffee cups, breath occasionally visible in the corners farthest from the kitchen. Sarah noticed the old man's jacket first. The corduroy had been worn before, but now it was threadbare, elbows patched with fabric that didn't quite match, collar frayed to the point of unraveling. His shoes had holes near the toes, carefully covered with duct tape that peeled at the edges. He pulled the jacket tighter around his frame with hands that shook not just from age, but from cold that reached bone deep. One particularly bitter morning in January, Sarah made a decision. She'd packed lunch the night before, homemade vegetable soup, still warm in its thermos, and half a sandwich she'd planned to eat during her break. Instead, she carried it to the corner booth and set it down beside his coffee. "What's this?" His voice carried surprise tinged with something that might have been suspicion. "Lunch. It's cold today. You need something warm." "I can't. Please." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "I can grab something later from the kitchen. It's no trouble." The old man looked at the thermos, then at Sarah, then back at the soup. Something shifted in his eyes, a crack in whatever walls he'd built around himself. He nodded once slowly and unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. The steam rose between them like a bridge. From that day forward, the pattern changed. 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sarah brought her own lunch and gave it to the old man. She'd pack extra in the morning, telling herself it was practical, that she was just being smart about portions. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She was going hungry so someone else wouldn't. The weight came off gradually. 5 pounds, then 8, then 12. Her uniform hung looser on her frame. The dark circles under her eyes deepened into bruises. She moved through her shifts with the careful precision of someone running on fumes. Every gesture calculated to conserve energy she no longer possessed. Monica noticed first. "Sarah, when's the last time you ate?" "I eat. I've been watching. You skip breakfast. You give your lunch to the ghost. You're too tired to eat dinner when you get home. You're literally wasting away." Sarah tied her apron tighter, hiding how loose it had become. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're starving yourself for a stranger who gives you nothing back. No money, no gratitude, nothing. What are you getting out of this?" The question landed heavier than Monica intended. Sarah paused, her hand stilling on the coffee pot. What was she getting? Certainly not financial reward. Her bank account remained stubbornly negative. Not recognition. Most of the staff thought she was foolish. Not even consistent gratitude from the old man himself, who still spent most mornings staring out the window in silence. "He gives me something you can't see on a tip line," Sarah said finally. What? Enlighten me. What invisible benefit is worth you collapsing for malnutrition? Sarah met her co-worker's eyes. He makes me feel like I'm still the person my mother raised. Like debt and exhaustion in this. She gestured at the diner, at their uniforms, at the life they'd both been trapped in. Hasn't killed the part of me that still believes people matter more than profit. Monica stared at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head, grabbed her order pad, and walked away without another word. But Sarah continued. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she packed her lunch and gave it away. She drank water when hunger clawed at her stomach. She told herself she was fine, that she could manage, that this mattered more than her own discomfort. The old man noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. "You're losing weight," he said one morning, his voice carrying an edge of concern that surprised them both. "I'm fine." You're giving me food. You need yourself." Sarah refreshed his coffee, avoiding his gaze. "I have enough, Sarah." The use of her name stopped her mid-turn. He rarely used it, preferring the comfortable distance of silence. "Why are you doing this?" She could have lied, could have deflected with a joke, or changed the subject. Instead, she told the truth. "Because someone should. Because you matter. Because if I stop believing that kindness is worth the cost, then what's left?" The old man studied her face with an intensity that should have felt invasive, but somehow didn't. Then he nodded slowly, something resolving in his expression that she couldn't quite read. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. Sarah's throat tightened. She managed a small smile and walked away before the tears could fall. She had no idea that every sacrifice was being recorded. No idea that her willingness to suffer for a stranger's comfort was a final piece of a test she didn't know she was taking. No idea that in 3 weeks, everything would shatter and rebuild into something she couldn't possibly imagine. Sarah just knew that when she looked at the old man, really looked at him, she saw her mother's face in the hospital bed, wasted by illness, still smiling when Sarah brought her flowers they couldn't afford. Some things mattered more than survival. Some things were worth the cost. Tuesday morning arrived with the same pale light that filtered through Rosie's diner windows every day. But something fundamental had shifted in the universe. 6:45 came and went. The corner booth remained empty. Sarah stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, watching the door with an intensity that made her chest ache. He was late. That was all. Traffic, maybe. A doctor's appointment. Something simple and explainable that didn't warrant the knot forming in her stomach. By 7:15, she'd refilled the pot twice, wiped down tables that were already clean, and invented reasons to walk past the window. The parking lot stretched empty under the winter sky, offering no answers. "Your ghost stood you up," Monica said, not unkindly. "Probably found a place with better coffee." Sarah forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. Probably. But the unease wouldn't leave. It settled into her bones, a wrongness she couldn't articulate. Wednesday morning, 6:45. The booth remained empty. Sarah made the coffee anyway, black, exactly 190 degrees, and set it on the table as if force of habit could summon him back. The steam rose and dissipated into nothing. The toast she'd prepared grew cold. "Sarah, you okay?" Brian asked, noticing her standing motionless by the window. "Fine. Just wondering where he is. Maybe he moved. Maybe he died. Old people do that." Brian's pragmatism was meant to be helpful. It landed like a punch. Thursday arrived bitter and gray. Sarah came in early, 45 minutes before her shift, and positioned herself by the window with fresh coffee ready. She watched every car that passed, every pedestrian who shuffled down Maple Street, bundled against the cold. Monica found her there an hour later, still watching. Maybe he finally found a place with better service. Or maybe he just got tired of charity from someone who can't afford it. The word stung because they carried truth Sarah didn't want to examine. Had she been patronizing him? Had her kindness felt like pity? Had she driven him away with the weight of her own need to matter? By Friday, the concern had crystallized into something approaching grief. Sarah moved through her shift like a ghost herself, mechanically taking orders and delivering food, while her mind spun through increasingly dark possibilities. He'd fallen in his apartment, and no one had found him. He'd gotten sick, and had no one to call. He'd simply decided she wasn't worth the effort of showing up for anymore. The worst part was realizing how much she'd come to depend on those 15 minutes. How much that daily ritual had anchored her chaos. The old man in the corner booth had become the only constant in a life defined by instability. And now he was gone without explanation or goodbye. She'd been caring for a stranger, but somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being strange. And now she might never know what happened to him. Saturday morning exploded with the breakfast rush. Families cramming into booths. Construction workers lined up at the counter. The griddles sizzling with eggs and bacon. Conversations overlapping into white noise that filled every corner of Rosie's diner. Then the door opened, and the world stopped. 6 men entered in perfect formation. They wore identical dark suits that looked carved from shadows, moved with military precision utterly alien to the diner's comfortable chaos. Earpieces caught the light. Their eyes scanned the room with the cold efficiency of people trained to identify threats before they materialized. They were built like granite. Broad shoulders, thick necks, hands that rested near their jackets in a way that suggested concealed weapons. The entire diner fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the griddle seemed to quiet, as if the sizzle of bacon feared interrupting whatever was about to happen. Behind the wall of bodyguards came a 7th man. Silver hair swept back from a face that radiated authority. Expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. Leather briefcase that looked like it had witnessed congressional hearings. He was in his 60s, but carried himself with the vigor of someone 20 years younger. Everything about him screamed power, old money. The kind of person who'd never stepped foot in a place like Rosie's diner and found it quaint rather than depressing. He walked directly toward Sarah, ignoring the other customers, the manager frozen behind the register, the waitresses who'd stopped mid-service to stare. His shoes clicked against the linoleum with purpose. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. The man stopped 3 feet away, his eyes sharp and assessing, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Are you Sarah and Mitchell?" His voice carried the formal precision of courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. Sarah's throat had gone dry. She managed a nod, unable to form words. The man's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a crack in the professional armor. "My name is Richard Callahan. I'm the senior partner at Callahan & Associates, a law firm specializing in estate planning and wealth management." He paused, as if giving her time to process. "I represent the estate of Robert James Mitchell." The name hit Sarah like cold water. Robert. The old man had a name, a full name, and a lawyer, and bodyguards. Nothing about this made sense. Richard continued, his voice gentler now. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. Given the substantial nature of Mr. Mitchell's estate and certain complications with other beneficiaries, security protocols were deemed necessary." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I don't understand. Who is Robert James Mitchell?" "The gentleman you've been carrying for these past 8 months." Richard's eyes held something that might have been respect. "Mr. Mitchell passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 nights ago. Tuesday evening, approximately 9:40 p.m. The coffee pot slipped from Sarah's fingers. It shattered against the floor, hot liquid spreading across linoleum. Ceramic shards scattering like shrapnel. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the continued silence of the diner. Tuesday evening. That's why he hadn't come Wednesday morning, hadn't come Thursday, hadn't come Friday. He was gone. The grief hit Sarah with unexpected force, buckling her knees. One of the bodyguards moved forward instinctively, but Richard waved him back. Sarah caught herself against the counter, her vision blurring. She'd barely known him. 8 months of coffee and toast and fragments of conversation. She didn't know his favorite color, didn't know his birthday, didn't know if he had children or what his laugh sounded like. She knew almost nothing about Robert James Mitchell, but she knew the tremor in his hands when he held his coffee cup, knew the way his eyes tracked families laughing over pancakes with an expression that ached, knew that he'd lost his wife and that loss had hollowed him out until kindness from a stranger became the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. And now he was gone, and she'd never told him he mattered. Never told him that those 15 minutes anchored her day. Never told him thank you for letting her feel like a decent human being, when everything else in her life screamed failure. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry." Richard's voice remained gentle. "Mr. Mitchell's final will and testament contains provisions that require your immediate presence at our offices. He was quite specific about the timing and the necessity of your attendance." Sarah looked up, confusion cutting through grief. "Why? I'm nobody. I serve him coffee." "You did considerably more than that, Miss Mitchell." Richard reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather-bound journal. He opened it to a marked page and began reading, his voice taking on the cadence of someone else's words. "Coffee, black, precisely 190 degrees. Tested with a thermometer she keeps in her apron pocket to ensure it never burns my hands. 2 slices of wheat toast lightly buttered, not drenched, just enough to soften without making it soggy. Cut diagonally because she once mentioned her mother did it that way. Served at 6:45 every morning without fail. Purchased from her own wages when I offered nothing in return." Richard looked up from a journal. "That's from January 16th. Shall I continue?" Sarah couldn't speak. The old man had been writing about her, recording details she hadn't realized anyone noticed. Richard turned pages. February 3rd. Today a customer berated her for 10 minutes because his eggs were too runny. She apologized, remade his breakfast, and when he left without tipping, she smiled at him anyway. Afterward, she stood in the back hallway and cried for exactly 90 seconds, then dried her eyes and returned to work. Grace under impossible pressure. He turned more pages. March 27th. She's losing weight. Brings me her lunch on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, then claims she'll eat later. She won't. I've watched her drink water and tell herself she's fine. She's starving herself to feed a stranger who appears to give her nothing in return. This is not obligation. This is character. Sarah's hands were shaking. 8 months. He'd been documenting 8 months of her life, cataloging gestures she thought were invisible. "Mr. Mitchell observed you very carefully, Miss Mitchell. Every act of kindness. Every moment you chose grace when cruelty would have been easier. Every sacrifice you made without expectation of reward." Richard closed the journal. He noticed everything. Monica appeared at Sarah's elbow, steadying her. "Sarah, you don't have to go anywhere with these people." But Richard was already extending a business card. "The reading of the will is scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning. Given the complexity of Mr. Mitchell's estate and the nature of your bequest, your presence is not optional. It's legally required." He paused. "And Miss Mitchell? You want to hear what he left you?" Sarah took the card with numb fingers. The embossed lettering swam in her vision. Callahan and Associates, Estate Planning and Wealth Management. Wealth management. The old man who couldn't afford coffee had a wealth management lawyer. Nothing about this made sense, but Sarah found herself nodding anyway. "Okay, I'll come." Richard's expression warmed slightly. "My car is outside. I'll drive you personally." As Sarah untied her apron with trembling hands, she caught Monica's whispered question. "What's happening?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She only knew that the ghost in the corner booth had left her something important enough to require bodyguards, expensive lawyers, and a reading of the will that legally demanded her presence. She had no idea her entire life was about to shatter and rebuild into something she couldn't possibly imagine. But she was about to find out. The Mercedes waited at the curb like a panther, sleek, black, utterly out of place on Maple Street where most vehicles were held together with rust and optimism. One of the bodyguards opened the rear door, and Richard gestured for Sarah to enter. She slid into leather seats so soft they felt like a violation after years of duct-tape vinyl. The interior smelled of polish and money, climate-controlled air washing over her skin with a gentleness that made her suddenly aware of how cold she'd been. Forever, maybe. The door closed with a sound that spoke of German engineering and price tags she couldn't fathom. Richard settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. The bodyguards distributed themselves between 2 additional vehicles, a formation that suggested this wasn't standard procedure for reading wills. The drive took them from Sarah's working-class neighborhood into territories she'd only glimpsed from bus windows. The buildings grew taller, shinier, more impossible. Glass towers reflected clouds and sky, creating the illusion of structures built from frozen air. People on these streets wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent, carried briefcases that probably held decisions affecting thousands of lives. Sarah looked down at her uniform. Pale blue dress faded from too many washes. White apron stained with coffee and grease that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. She'd forgotten to remove it in her shock. Now she sat in a vehicle that cost more than she'd earned in 5 years, wearing the evidence of her poverty like a billboard. "Mr. Mitchell spoke of you often," Richard said, his voice gentle enough to cut through her spiraling thoughts, particularly in his final months. Sarah's throat tightened. "What did he say?" "That you had his daughter's heart." Richard glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "He said that very specifically. Not that you were kind like her, or generous like her. That you had her actual heart, the essential core of who she'd been before the world got complicated." "I don't understand." "You will." Richard turned his attention to the passing cityscape. Robert James Mitchell was a complicated man, brilliant, ruthless when necessary, capable of extraordinary vision. But he was also profoundly lonely, the kind of loneliness that wealth can't touch, that success makes worse, that hollows you out until you're not sure there's anything left worth saving. Sarah thought about the old man staring out the diner window, watching families he'd never be part of, nursing cold coffee because it gave him somewhere to exist for 2 hours. "He found something in those mornings with you," Richard continued, "something he'd lost decades ago. Proof that genuine kindness still existed without transaction, without calculation, without expectation of return." The Mercedes turned onto a street where even the pavement looked expensive. They pulled into an underground garage beneath a tower that seemed to pierce clouds. Sarah's hands were shaking again. "Mr. Callahan, I'm a waitress who barely finished high school. I don't belong wherever we're going." Richard met her eyes directly. "Miss Mitchell, you're about to discover that belonging has nothing to do with credentials or bank accounts. Robert chose you very deliberately. Trust that he knew what he was doing." The car stopped. The bodyguards emerged first, scanning the garage with professional paranoia. Then Richard opened Sarah's door himself, offering his hand like she was someone important. She took it, stepped out into a world she'd never imagined entering, and followed him toward an elevator that would carry her 47 floors above the life she'd known. She had no idea that everything, every assumption, every understanding of who she was and where she came from, was about to explode. The elevator moved so smoothly Sarah barely felt the ascent. 47 floors passed in silence, broken only by soft classical music and the hammer of her own heartbeat. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that redefined her understanding of wealth. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished to a mirror shine that reflected her scuffed sneakers with cruel clarity. Original artwork hung on walls, not prints, but actual paintings with visible brushstrokes and museum-quality frames. The furniture looked like it had been individually crafted by artisans who signed their work. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city spread below like a kingdom. Sarah felt like a stray cat that had wandered into a palace. Every step seemed too loud, too clumsy, too obviously wrong. "This way, please." Richard guided her down a corridor lined with offices where serious people made serious decisions about serious money. They stopped at a conference room with a table that could easily seat 20. Its surface so flawlessly polished, Sarah could see her own reflection staring back with wide, frightened eyes. 3 people were already present, and they radiated wealth the way fires radiate heat, impossible to miss, uncomfortable to be near. The woman sat at the head of the table like it was a throne. Veronica Mitchell Ashford, mid-50s, wearing a designer suit that strained across her frame in ways that suggested recent weight gain she refused to acknowledge. Diamonds glittered on every finger, rings layered so thick they looked like armor. Her hair was professionally colored to hide gray, styled with the aggressive perfection of someone who paid more for hair appointments than Sarah earned in a month. Everything about her screamed money, breeding, and the absolute certainty that she deserved both. Beside her sat a younger man who could only be her son. Marcus Mitchell, early 30s, expensive watch catching the light. Blazer tailored so precisely it probably had his initials embroidered inside. But the tailoring couldn't hide the softness around his middle, the petulant twist to his mouth, the expression of someone who'd never been denied anything and resented the few times he'd been forced to wait. The third person stood by the windows, hands clasped behind his back like a military officer surveying conquered territory. Bradley Mitchell, late 40s. Robert's nephew, according to the family tree visible in Sarah's peripheral understanding. His hair was thinning, slicked back, with product that made it look wet. He assessed Sarah with eyes that calculated value the way a pawnbroker examines jewelry. Quickly, dismissively, with the assumption that nothing presented would be worth the effort. Veronica's gaze landed on Sarah like a physical weight. Her expression shifted through confusion to comprehension to contempt in the space of 3 seconds. "This is who we've been waiting for." Her voice dripped with disdain so pure it could have been bottled and sold. "A waitress." Marcus leaned forward, squinting as if Sarah were difficult to see clearly. Then he laughed, a short, ugly sound. Grandfather's final joke, keeping us waiting for the help. Bradley turned from the window, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "I hope she's at least entertaining. We've been here 20 minutes for this mystery beneficiary." Sarah's face burned. She wanted to defend herself, to point out that she'd been working a shift when Richard arrived, that she'd come immediately, that she hadn't asked for any of this. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of training that taught her people like this didn't care about explanations for people like her. Richard's voice cut through the mockery like a blade. "Miss Mitchell arrived within the time frame specified in the will. We're beginning precisely on schedule." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Sarah sank into a seat that probably cost more than her car. Veronica's perfume, something expensive and overwhelming, made her eyes water. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table with barely contained impatience. Bradley returned to his position by the window, watching with the expression of someone anticipating entertainment. Richard opened his briefcase and withdrew a leather folder embossed with gold lettering. "We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Robert James Mitchell, deceased. As the executor of his estate and senior partner of the firm that managed his affairs for 30 years, I'll be reading the provisions he outlined in his final documents." "Finally," Veronica muttered, "can we skip the formalities and get to the numbers?" Richard ignored her. Mr. Mitchell was very specific about how this reading should proceed. "I'll ask that you refrain from interrupting until I've finished each section." He opened the folder. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Richard's voice took on the formal cadence of legal documents, words that had been written months ago by a man who'd known exactly what storm he was creating. "To my sister, Veronica Mitchell Ashford, who has consistently reminded me of her loyalty and service to the family name, I leave the sum of $2 million, to be distributed in a trust managed by Callahan and Associates." Veronica's face went red. The color started at her neck and climbed like a thermometer measuring rage. $2 million? That's it. "Please hold your questions," Richard said mildly. After 40 years of family loyalty, after managing his social calendar, hosting his business dinners, maintaining the family reputation while he played hermit, her voice climbed with each word. $2 million is an insult. Marcus placed a hand on his mother's arm, but his own expression had gone tight. "Let him finish." Richard continued. "To my grandnephew Marcus William Mitchell, I leave the sum of $1 million and the property located at 4782 Mountain View Drive, commonly known as the Vermont Summer House, including all furnishings and contents." Marcus's jaw clenched. $1 million, plus a house he hasn't visited in a decade. "It's a $3 million property," Richard noted, "with significant historical value. It's a money pit in the middle of nowhere that costs a fortune to maintain." Marcus's careful composure had cracked. "This is what I get for visiting him every month, for pretending to care about his boring stories, for putting up with his tests and lectures. To my nephew Bradley Charles Mitchell, I leave the sum of $500,000 and the complete vintage automobile collection currently housed at the Mitchell family estate, including the 1967 Shelby Cobra, 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, and 7 additional vehicles as cataloged in Appendix C." Bradley's smirk had vanished. $500,000 and some cars? "The collection is valued at approximately $1.2 million, Richard said, conservatively. "So 1.7 total." While she, Bradley jabbed a finger at Veronica, "gets $2 million plus whatever trust income that generates." The mood in the room had curdled into something toxic. These people had expected tens of millions, not these modest amounts that barely qualified as wealth by their standards. Sarah watched the dissolution of a family in real time, united only by their shared outrage at not receiving more. Richard turned a page. His eyes found Sarah. To Sarah and Mitchell, who showed kindness when it cost her everything and expected nothing in return, who shared her lunch when she had none to spare, who saw a human being when others saw an inconvenience. The relatives leaned forward like wolves scenting blood, anticipating entertainment in Sarah's humiliation. I leave the sum of $250,000 to be distributed immediately with no restrictions, to be used for educational purposes, debt forgiveness, or any other purpose she deems appropriate. The silence lasted exactly 2 heartbeats. Then the room erupted. Veronica shot to her feet, so fast her chair toppled backward. $250,000? To a stranger. Marcus's voice rose to match his mother's. To some random waitress who gave him toast, while we actual family get scraps. Bradley's laugh was acid. This is insane. He's giving away more to the help than to his own blood. On what possible grounds? Sarah couldn't breathe. $250,000. The number was so large it didn't feel real. That was her medical debt, her credit cards, her student loans, her entire financial crisis, erased, with money left over. Enough to actually go to culinary school. Enough to stop drowning. But looking at the faces around the table, the rage, the contempt, the absolute certainty that she'd somehow stolen what belonged to them, Sarah felt like she'd been handed a bomb instead of a gift. This will be contested, Veronica said flatly. No competent lawyer would let this stand. On what grounds? Richard's voice remained professionally neutral. Mr. Mitchell was thoroughly evaluated by 3 independent psychiatrists in the months before his death. He was found to be of completely sound mind and clear judgment. Then she manipulated him, Marcus insisted. Preyed on a lonely old man. Convinced him to change his will. Miss Mitchell didn't know Mr. Mitchell's real identity, Richard countered. She had no knowledge of his wealth, his properties, or his family connections. The documentation is quite clear. Subscribe now. You want to see what happens when Sarah learns the full truth. Documentation can be fabricated, Bradley said coldly, especially when a gold digger is involved. Sarah found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than she intended. I didn't know. I swear I had no idea who he was. Of course you did. Veronica's voice dripped poison. Poor lonely old man. Rich young woman with debt. Tale as old as time. Richard's patience was clearly wearing thin. If we could return to the reading, there are additional provisions. The relatives fell silent, but their expressions promised this wasn't over. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them in her lap. She thought the money was the bomb. She had no idea the real explosion was still coming. Richard adjusted his reading glasses and returned to the document, his voice regaining its formal precision. Additionally, Miss Mitchell receives full ownership of the commercial property located at 847 Maple Street, including the building, all fixtures, equipment, and associated business operations. Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because Richard clarified. Rosie's Diner, Miss Mitchell. He left you Rosie's Diner. The building where she worked. The diner where she served coffee and cleaned tables and absorbed abuse from customers who saw her as furniture. He'd left her the place she was already trapped in. Sarah couldn't process why that would be considered a gift. She already spent 60 hours a week there. Now she'd owned the privilege of being responsible for its failing equipment, health code violations, and perpetual financial struggle. Veronica's laughter shattered the confusion. It started as a chuckle and built into something approaching hysteria. He leaves her a failing diner? Oh, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Marcus joined in, his earlier anger transforming into cruel amusement. Grandfather leaves us millions and gives her a cage. At least he had a sense of humor. That place loses money every quarter, Veronica managed between laughs. Have fun with that bankruptcy, sweetheart. Maybe you'll be lucky and a developer will buy you out for the land value before you're drowning in debt. Bradley's smirk had returned, sharper than before. Hope you know how to fix commercial refrigerators, because that place is one health inspection away from being condemned. The equipment is ancient, the building needs a new roof, and the neighborhood is circling the drain. Sarah felt the weight of their mockery like physical blows. They were right. Rosie's diner was barely surviving. Brian had mentioned multiple times that they were running on borrowed time, patching equipment that should have been replaced years ago, ignoring problems they couldn't afford to fix. The old man had given her responsibility for a sinking ship. Maybe that's all she'd ever been worth to him. Someone to inherit his failure. The diner itself generates minimal profit, Richard acknowledged, his tone suggesting this wasn't the full story. However, nothing, Marcus interrupted. She gets a worthless property and we're supposed to be grateful for our modest inheritances? This is a joke. If you would allow me to finish, Richard said, his patience clearly approaching its limit. Veronica waved her hand dismissively. By all means, tell us what other treasures grandfather left for his favorite charity case. Richard's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. As I was saying, the diner itself generates minimal profit. However, included with the property is the commercial real estate portfolio attached to the business. The words hung in the air like smoke before fire. What portfolio? Bradley's smirk had frozen. Richard's voice remained professional and precise, but Sarah caught the hint of satisfaction beneath the formality. Mr. Mitchell purchased the entire block surrounding Rosie's Diner over the past 40 years. For commercial buildings currently leased to various businesses, 2 residential properties generating rental income, and the parking structure serving the downtown district. All properties are owned free and clear, with no outstanding mortgages or liens. The room had gone silent again, but this silence felt different, dangerous. The complete portfolio is currently valued at approximately $7.3 million. Veronica's face drained of color, so fast Sarah thought she might faint. The transformation was startling, from red rage to bone-white shock in the space of a single breath. What did you say? $7.3 million, Richard repeated calmly. The portfolio generates approximately $400,000 in annual rental income after expenses and property management fees. Miss Mitchell now owns all of it. Marcus made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. That's not possible. We would have known. Someone would have told us. Mr. Mitchell was quite private about his real estate acquisitions, Richard said. He purchased properties through various LLC structures, paid cash to avoid public financing records, and specifically instructed that the portfolio remain confidential until after his death. Bradley had gone very still, his earlier smugness evaporated. $8 million. You're telling me he gave a waitress $8 million while his actual family splits $4 million between the 3 of us? $7.3 million in property, plus $250,000 in liquid assets, Richard corrected. Yes. Sarah couldn't breathe. The numbers were so large they'd stopped meaning anything. $7 million. She'd been sharing her lunch with a man who owned $7 million in real estate, and she'd been worried about him being cold. This will be contested, Veronica said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. We'll fight this. We'll prove incompetence, undue influence something. You're welcome to try, Richard said mildly. Mr. Mitchell anticipated that possibility. He left very detailed documentation explaining his reasoning, along with psychiatric evaluations, witness testimonies, and 8 months of journal entries documenting his observations. I suspect any judge reviewing the evidence will find his intentions quite clear. His intentions to screw over his own family. Marcus's voice cracked. We're blood. We're Mitchell family. She's nobody. She was kind when it cost her everything, Richard said, his professional mask slipping slightly. She shared her food when she was going hungry. She treated him with dignity when he appeared to have nothing to offer in return. That, apparently, was worth more to Mr. Mitchell than 40 years of obligatory family visits. The words hit like grenades. Veronica's mouth opened and closed without sound. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Bradley's hands had clenched into fists. Sarah wanted to apologize, to explain she hadn't asked for this, to make them understand she'd never expected anything beyond being decent to another human being. But the words wouldn't come. The diner wasn't a cage. It was a kingdom hidden in plain sight. And the old man in the corner booth had been a king in disguise, testing her without her knowledge, measuring her character against a standard she hadn't known existed. There's more, Richard said quietly. Veronica's laugh was broken. More? What else could there possibly be? Richard pulled out a second folder, this one thicker. The explanation. Mr. Mitchell wanted you all to understand why he made these choices. He opened the folder and withdrew photographs. The first showed a much younger Robert Mitchell, 40 years younger maybe, standing beside a woman with kind eyes, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. The child had dark hair and a smile that lit her entire face. Richard slid the photo across the table to Sarah. Do you recognize anyone in this picture? Sarah studied the image. The woman looked vaguely familiar in the way old photographs sometimes do. Features that might echo in someone you know, but can't quite place. But the little girl, her breath caught. The child was wearing a necklace, a small silver heart on a delicate chain. Sarah had the same necklace in a box under her bed, inherited from her mother along with costume jewelry and expired coupons and the detritus of a life cut short. That's my mother, Sarah whispered. That's my mother when she was little. Richard's expression softened. Yes, that's Elizabeth and Mitchell, Robert's daughter, your mother. The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her vision narrowing to the photograph in her hands. The little girl who would grow up to be her mother, the woman who must have been her grandmother, and the man, Robert James Mitchell, was your grandfather, Richard said gently. Your mother's father. He's been searching for you for 40 years. The words didn't make sense. Sarah's grandfather had died before she was born. That's what her mother had always said. Both grandparents gone. No family left except the two of them against the world. My mother told me her parents were dead. Your mother believed they might as well be. Richard withdrew more documents, legal papers, custody agreements, police reports. Robert and his wife Diana divorced when Elizabeth was 3 years old. The marriage had been troubled for years, complicated by Diana's untreated mental health issues and Robert's obsession with building his business. The divorce was bitter. Diana was awarded primary custody. He pulled out another document. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Diana disappeared with Elizabeth, changed their names, moved across the country, severed all connection with Robert and the Mitchell family. Robert hired investigators, filed missing persons reports, searched for years. But Diana was careful. She used cash, avoided paper trails, taught Elizabeth that her father was dangerous and had abandoned them. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly, the photograph blurred. My mother's name was Elizabeth Barrett, not Mitchell. Barrett was Diana's maiden name, Richard confirmed. She reclaimed it after the divorce and gave it to your mother. Legal name change, new social security numbers, complete reinvention. By the time Elizabeth was 10, she barely remembered her father. By the time she was 20, she believed he'd never wanted her in the first place. But he was looking for her, Sarah said, her voice breaking. He was looking the whole time. Every day for 40 years, Richard said softly. He hired the best investigators, followed every lead, never gave up hope. And then 6 months ago, he found you. He withdrew another document. DNA testing service. Your mother encouraged you to take one, correct? Sarah nodded numbly. Her mother had been fascinated by genealogy in her final months, wanting Sarah to understand where she came from, to have some connection to family after she was gone. Sarah had spit in a tube and mailed it off, thinking nothing of it. Robert had been monitoring every major DNA database for years, Richard explained. When your results appeared, the match was immediate. Granddaughter, direct descendant of Robert James Mitchell. He'd finally found you. Veronica had been silent through this revelation, her expression cycling through shock and understanding and finally resignation. So that's why he changed the will. She's actual family. She's more than that, Richard said. She's his second chance. His daughter died hating him, believing he'd abandoned her. He couldn't fix that, but he could find Elizabeth's daughter. He could know her, understand who she'd become, see if any part of Elizabeth's goodness had survived. So he went undercover, Bradley said slowly, his earlier contempt replaced by something that might have been grudging respect. Pretended to be poor, homeless practically, to see what kind of person she was. Exactly, Richard confirmed. He needed to know if Sarah was kind because of blood obligation or because of character. Would she be decent to a stranger who appeared to have nothing? Would she sacrifice when it cost her? Would she show grace under pressure when no one was watching and no reward was offered? Richard opened the leather journal again. He documented everything. 8 months of observation. Every gesture, every sacrifice, every moment of grace. And what he found, Richard's voice grew thick with emotion, was his daughter. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. Sarah had Elizabeth's heart. The kindness that money couldn't corrupt, that poverty couldn't kill, that hardship only seemed to strengthen. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photograph of a little girl who'd grown into her mother, who died still believing her father hadn't loved her. He wanted to tell you, Richard said. In his final days, he wanted to reveal himself, to explain everything. But he was afraid you'd hate him for the deception, for testing you, for letting your mother die without reconciliation. So he decided to tell you through this, through the will, through the gifts, through the evidence that he'd been watching and caring and loving you from a distance. Richard slid another photo across the table. This one showed Sarah at the diner, taken from across the street through the window. She was refilling the old man's coffee, smiling at something he'd said. Someone had drawn a circle around her face and written in careful handwriting. She has Elizabeth's smile. After 40 years, I finally found her again. The money is for your freedom, Richard said quietly. Freedom from the debt that was crushing you. Freedom to pursue your dreams the way Elizabeth never could. The diner is for your heart, a place to practice kindness, to build community, to make a difference in ordinary lives. And the properties, he gestured to the portfolio documentation. Those are for your future. Security, stability, the ability to help others the way you helped him. Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process. Her grandfather, the old man in the corner booth, had been her grandfather. He'd found her, tested her, loved her from a distance while she'd known nothing except that a lonely stranger needed coffee and toast. Veronica spoke finally, her voice subdued. He was playing dress up, pretending to be poor, while he decided if she deserved his fortune. Richard's response was ice. He was discovering who among you would show him kindness without expectation of reward, who would sacrifice without calculating return, who would be decent to someone who appeared to have nothing to offer. He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member in turn. The answer, apparently, was no one in this room except Sarah. The condemnation in his words hung heavy. These people had visited Robert out of obligation, had tolerated his company while calculating their inheritance, had seen him as a means to wealth rather than a human being worthy of love. Sarah had just seen him as someone who needed coffee, and that, apparently, had made all the difference. Sarah's apartment had never felt so small and so vast at the same time. She sat cross-legged on her kitchen floor, the linoleum cracked and peeling, a persistent water stain spreading across the ceiling like a map of somewhere she'd never visit, holding a certified check that represented more money than she'd earned in 10 years of double shifts and burnt coffee. $250,000, made out to Sarah and Mitchell, signed by Richard Callahan as executor of this estate. Her hands trembled so badly, the paper rustled like leaves in wind. The laptop sat open on the counter above her, its screen casting blue light across the kitchen that had witnessed 3 years of silent panic attacks and whispered prayers to God she'd stopped believing in somewhere between her mother's diagnosis and the second collection agency call. Sarah pulled the computer down to her lap and logged into her bank account. The homepage loaded with its familiar dread: red numbers, negative balances, warnings about overdraft fees that charge her money for not having money. She navigated to bill pay with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from her body. First stop, medical debt, $19,473. The balance that had followed her like a shadow, growing with interest charges that compounded while she slept. She entered the amount. Click confirm. Watched the number zero out. Paid in full. The words didn't feel real. Next, credit cards. $8,216 across 3 cards. She'd maxed out keeping the electricity on while her mother underwent chemotherapy. Card 1 cleared. Card 2 cleared. Card 3 cleared. Her student loans from the single semester she'd completed before her mother got sick, eliminated. For the first time in 3 years, every balance showed black instead of red, positive instead of negative, possible instead of hopeless. Sarah closed the laptop carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever spell had transformed her financial ruin into solvency. Then she stood, walked to her bedroom, and pulled a battered shoebox from under her bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, her mother's jewelry, a few photographs, expired coupons her mother had been too sick to use, and an envelope Sarah had opened only once since receiving it. The acceptance letter from the Portland Culinary Institute. She unfolded it with reverence reserved for sacred texts. The paper had creased where she'd gripped it too tightly the first time she'd read it, her dreams folding in on themselves like origami in reverse. The words remained unchanged: congratulations, acceptance, enrollment deadline that had passed 2 years ago. But deadlines could be extended. Programs could be reapplied to. Dreams that had been folded and stored could be unfolded and lived. Sarah sat on her kitchen floor, still holding the letter, and wept. Not the silent tears she'd learned to cry in bathroom stalls during her breaks. Not the controlled grief she'd permitted herself at her mother's funeral, while strangers who'd never called during the illness offered empty condolences. This was raw, ugly crying that came from somewhere deep and long suppressed. The sound of 3 years of pressure finally, miraculously released. She cried for her mother, who'd died, believing her own father had abandoned her. She cried for the old man who'd searched 40 years and found family only in the last 8 months of his life. She cried for herself, for the girl who'd had dreams, lost them, and now held them again in trembling hands. The weight she'd carried for so long, the crushing, suffocating weight of debt and hopelessness and just barely surviving, lifted like fog burning away under morning sun. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell could breathe. Monday morning arrived with the same pale light that had always filtered through Rosie's diner windows. But Sarah felt like she was walking into a dream that had borrowed reality's appearance without quite mastering the details. She tied her apron with movements perfected through years of muscle memory. The fabric felt different somehow, lighter, less like a uniform and more like a costume she was choosing to wear. Because she could choose now. She didn't need this job. Didn't need to smile at customers who treated her like furniture, or absorb Brian's perpetual disappointment, or pretend the grease stains on her dress were anything other than badges of survival. But she came anyway, because she didn't know what else to do with herself on a Monday morning at 5:30. Brian greeted her with his usual gruffness. "Mitchell, you're late." She wasn't. She was exactly on time. But arguing would be pointless. "Sorry." Monica was already complaining about table 6, something about eggs that weren't scrambled enough and coffee that was too hot, and a customer who'd probably stiff her on the tip anyway. The familiar litany of grievances that constituted a normal morning at Rosie's. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and completely surreal. Sarah poured coffee, took orders, delivered plates of bacon and eggs with the practiced efficiency of someone who could navigate the diner blindfolded. But her mind kept circling back to the impossible truth. She owned this building, owned the block, owned properties worth $7 million. The waitress refilling coffee cup by coffee cup was also the landlord, the property owner, the person who could fire everyone here, including Brian, with a single phone call to Richard Callahan. But she didn't. She just kept working, because transformation apparently required more than a certified check and a reading. Mid-morning rush. The door opened, and a woman entered carrying a clipboard and an expression that made Brian's face go pale. "Health inspection," she announced, flashing credentials. Unannounced, as required by county regulations. Brian's panic was immediate and visible. "We weren't expecting. We're in the middle of..." "That's the point of unannounced inspection, sir." The inspector was already walking toward the kitchen, making notes. Sarah watched Brian follow her like a condemned man approaching the gallows. She knew what the inspector would find. Everyone who worked at Rosie's knew. The walk-in refrigerator that had been broken for weeks. Its temperature maintained through strategic placement of ice bags and prayers. The fryer that sparked occasionally, but still technically worked. The ventilation system that wheezed like an asthmatic trying to run a marathon. 15 minutes later, the inspector emerged with a clipboard full of violations. Her expression suggested she'd seen worse, but not recently. "The walk-in refrigerator is operating at 52 degrees, she said flatly. "Legal requirement is 40 or below. That's a critical violation. The ventilation system is not up to code. The dishwasher is leaking. The grease trap hasn't been cleaned in," she checked her notes. I'm not sure I want to know how long. Brian slumped against the counter, aging 10 years in 10 seconds. How much to fix it? Conservative estimate? $15,000 for the refrigerator alone. Another 8 for ventilation. Probably $25,000 total to bring everything up to code. She handed him the violation notice. You have 30 days to complete repairs and schedule a reinspection. If violations aren't corrected, this establishment will be closed. $25,000. An impossible sum. Brian didn't have $2,500, much less $25,000. That's it, he said quietly, the words falling like stones. We're done. I can't afford that. The inspector left. The breakfast rush continued around them, customers oblivious to the death sentence that had just been delivered. Monica caught Sarah's eye across the diner, her expression mixing sympathy with resignation. Everyone had known this day was coming. Rosie's had been running on borrowed time for years. Sarah took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. I'll handle it. Brian looked at her like she'd started speaking a language he didn't recognize. Sarah, you can't. I'll cover the repairs. All of them. The diner's ambient noise, clinking silverware conversations, the hiss of the griddle, seemed to quiet, though nothing had actually changed. Monica stared from across the room, her order pad frozen mid-notation. With what money? Brian's voice carried the gentle concern usually reserved for people experiencing mental breaks. Sarah, that's $25,000. You're a waitress. No offense, but Robert Mitchell left me the diner. The words came out steadier than Sarah expected. And everything else. I own this place now. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the griddle seemed to hold its breath. Monica spoke first, her voice climbing. You wait, what? The old man. The one in the corner booth. He was Robert Mitchell. He owned this building, and he left it to me. Sarah met Brian's eyes directly, along with the rest of the block. The properties. Everything. The revelation rippled through the staff like electricity. The cook leaned out from the kitchen, listening. The busboy stopped clearing tables. Whispers spread faster than spilled coffee. The waitress who fed the old man now owns a restaurant, owns the building, owns everything. Some faces showed genuine happiness. People Sarah had helped during tough shifts, had covered for when they called in sick, had split tips with when tables were slow. Others showed immediate resentment. Co-workers who'd mocked her for wasting time on a non-tipping customer, who'd questioned her sanity for sharing her lunch with a stranger. Brian's expression remained unreadable, cycling through shock and confusion and something that might have been fear. So am I fired? The question hung heavy. Sarah had the power to say yes. Could clean house, bring in new management, transform Rosie's into something that reflected her vision rather than decades of accumulated compromise and duct tape solutions. But she shook her head. No one's getting fired. This place runs because of you. I don't know how to manage a restaurant. Don't know how to handle suppliers or schedule staff or deal with inspectors. I'm going to need your help. She meant it. The humility in her voice was genuine, not calculated. Sarah Mitchell might own the building, but Brian knew how it worked, had kept it running through impossible circumstances for years. Brian's shoulders relaxed slightly, tension releasing like air from a punctured tire. You're serious. Completely. But we're making changes. Sarah straightened, finding authority she hadn't known she possessed. Real equipment, fair wages, no more duct tape and prayers holding this place together. We're going to fix everything that's broken and run this diner the way it should have been run all along. For the first time, people looked at her differently. Not as Sarah the waitress who could cover your shift or split your tips. As Sarah the owner who could change their lives with a signature. Monica approached slowly, her earlier resentment tempered by cautious hope. Fair wages? Like actual raises? Like actual living wages, Sarah confirmed. And benefits. Health insurance. Paid time off. The things you deserve for keeping this place alive. The cook emerged fully from the kitchen. Grease-stained apron and cautious optimism. New equipment? Like equipment that actually works. A walk-in that maintains temperature. A fryer that doesn't spark. Ventilation that doesn't sound like it's dying. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. We're going to make this place something we're proud of. The transformation was beginning, but not in the way anyone expected. Sarah wasn't becoming someone new. She was becoming more fully herself, with resources that matched her character instead of limiting it. Don't miss what happens when Sarah faces the Mitchell family's fury. Subscribe now. She'd been given a kingdom disguised as a diner, and she was going to honor the man who'd left it to her by making it matter, by using it to lift up the people who'd worked beside her when she had nothing. The corner booth remained empty, its brass plaque yet to be installed. But Sarah could feel her grandfather's presence anyway, watching from somewhere beyond the glass and vinyl and cracked linoleum, satisfied that his test had revealed exactly what he'd hoped to find. Kindness that didn't calculated return, grace that cost everything and expected nothing, character that wealth could reward but never purchase. Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. 2 weeks later, Richard Callahan's office called with a tone that immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. "Miss Mitchell, I need you to come in. There's been a development." The word development in a lawyer's vocabulary rarely preceded good news. Sarah arrived within an hour, still wearing her diner uniform, because she'd come straight from the lunch rush. Richard's expression confirmed her worst suspicions before he'd spoken a word. "Veronica and Marcus have filed a legal challenge to the will." Sarah sat heavily in the leather chair across from his desk. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming Robert wasn't of sound mind when he made his final revisions." Richard slid a folder across the desk. "Their argument is that he was suffering from dementia, that his judgment was impaired, and that you exploited a vulnerable elderly man for financial gain." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Exploited. The word tasted like poison. "That's not. I didn't even know who he was." "I know. Unfortunately, proving negative intent is complicated." Richard opened the folder, revealing legal documents dense with accusations. "They've hired 3 lawyers, expensive ones. They're also bringing in a psychiatrist willing to testify that Robert showed signs of cognitive decline in his final months." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. He was sharp as a knife. He noticed everything, remembered details, planned this whole thing with precision. "We have psychiatric evaluations confirming that," Richard assured her. 3 independent doctors examined Robert in the months before his death. All certified him as completely competent. But Veronica's lawyers will argue those evaluations were influenced, that you manipulated the testing process. "How?" "I didn't even know the testing was happening." Logic isn't their primary weapon here. Doubt is. Richard pulled out more documents. "There's more." Bradley has approached several board members of Mitchell Properties, rallying support for a hostile takeover attempt of the real estate portfolio. Sarah's stomach dropped. Can he do that? He's trying. His argument is that giving properties worth millions to, and I'm quoting his presentation here, "an uneducated waitress with no business experience puts company assets at unacceptable risk." Several board members are sympathetic to that position. "Old money protecting old money," Sarah said bitterly. "Exactly." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. The challenge could drag on for years. Legal fees will run into hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially millions if this goes to trial. And even if we win, the stress and publicity will be considerable. Sarah stared out the window at the city spread below. 47 floors up, problems looked smaller. Distance created the illusion that everything was manageable, that solutions existed if you could just see the pattern. But down on street level, where actual people lived and struggled and fought over inheritances, distance meant nothing. "What are my options?" Richard's pause told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "You can fight. We have evidence on our side. The psychiatric evaluations, Robert's journal, witness testimony. We'll probably win eventually, but eventually could be 3 years from now, and the cost will be devastating. Or you settle. Give the family a larger share of the estate in exchange for dropping the challenges and signing non-disclosure agreements. You'd still walk away with enough to change your life, maybe 2 million instead of 8, but free and clear with no legal battles. 2 million, a sum so large Sarah's brain struggled to process it. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Enough to go to culinary school 10 times over, buy a house, live comfortably forever. But it meant Giving up her grandfather's vision. Meant letting bullies win because fighting was too expensive. Meant abandoning the foundation she'd promised to create, the scholarships, the affordable housing. Meant betraying the man who'd tested her for 8 months and decided she was worthy. Sarah sat in silence, processing the impossible choice. Then she asked, "The board meeting, when is it?" Richard consulted his calendar. "Friday, 2 days from now. Bradley's presenting his case for removing you as property manager and transferring control to a professional management firm he conveniently happens to own 40% of. I want to attend." Richard's expression shifted to concern. "Miss Mitchell, that's hostile territory. These are people who've spent their entire lives in boardrooms, who eat inexperienced opponents for breakfast. They'll what? Underestimate me?" Sarah's voice carried an edge that surprised them both. "They've been doing that since the will reading. Let them keep doing it." Something changed in Richard's face, recognition perhaps, or respect. "You have a plan. I have truth." Sarah stood, energy returning to muscles that had felt dead moments before. "And I have 2 days to gather it." She spent the next 48 hours living in 2 worlds simultaneously. During the day, she worked her shifts at Rosie's, serving coffee and clearing tables and maintaining the fiction that nothing fundamental had changed. But her nights belonged to investigation, documentation, and building a case that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with character. She gathered photographs first, images of Robert at the diner, taken by customers who'd asked permission to photograph the charming old establishment, and unknowingly captured the ghost in the corner booth. Dated, time-stamped, showing 8 months of daily attendance. Next came receipts. Sarah had kept every single one. Proof of the toast she'd purchased from her own paycheck, the lunches she'd brought from home, the small kindnesses that had cost her while she was drowning in debt. Monica provided testimony, reluctantly at first. "I told you he was a waste of time. I mocked you for feeding him. Why would I help prove you were right?" "Because it's true," Sarah said simply. "And truth matters more than being right." Monica sighed and wrote out a statement documenting Sarah's sacrifices, her exhaustion, her weight loss from sharing meals she couldn't afford to give away. Other customers came forward too. The construction worker who'd watched Sarah slip extra fries to a homeless man. The nurse who'd seen her stay late to help the night cook. Small moments of grace witnessed by strangers who'd found them remarkable enough to remember. But Sarah's most powerful weapon came from Robert himself. His journal, hundreds of pages documenting not just his observations of Sarah, but his observations of everyone, his family included. She read about Veronica's failed boutique that Robert had bailed out to the tune of $300,000. About Marcus's gambling debts approaching $500,000 that Robert had quietly paid to avoid scandal. About Bradley's embezzlement from a Mitchell Properties subsidiary. $60,000 Robert had covered personally and buried to protect the family name. Years of financial bailouts covered scandals and enabled failures, all documented in Robert's meticulous handwriting, dated and detailed. He hadn't just been testing Sarah. He'd been documenting his entire family's character, measuring them against a standard they'd consistently failed to meet. By Thursday night, Sarah had built a case, not the kind that would satisfy lawyers, but the kind that might sway human beings with consciences that hadn't been completely purchased. Friday arrived with weather that matched Sarah's mood, gray skies threatening rain, air heavy with pressure that promised eventual release. She wore the only professional outfit she owned, a simple black dress purchased from a consignment store for her mother's funeral. It had cost $42 she couldn't afford, and she'd worn it exactly once before today. The fabric was quality, the cut classic. But standing in her apartment mirror, Sarah had seen what the board would see, a waitress playing dress-up, pretending to belong in spaces designed for people born to wealth. But she wore it anyway, because sometimes armor was psychological rather than practical. The Mitchell Properties building looked different in morning light. Less imposing maybe, or perhaps Sarah was different, less easily intimidated, more certain of her right to exist in spaces that want to exclude her. Richard met her in the lobby. "Last chance to reconsider. These people will not be kind. Kindness isn't what I'm here for." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm here for truth." The conference room on the 47th floor was already full when they arrived. Board members sat around the massive table. Mostly men, mostly white, mostly over 60, all wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. They regarded Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Veronica sat near the head of the table, flanked by her lawyers. She dressed for war, severe black suit, hair pulled back tight enough to serve as a facelift, jewelry that announced wealth without quite crossing into gaudy. Her smile when Sarah entered was pure acid. Marcus lounged beside his mother, attempting casual indifference, but succeeding only in looking nervous. Bradley stood near the windows, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the concerned family member protecting company interests from outside threats. Miss Mitchell, the chairman acknowledged, his tone suggesting he'd rather be acknowledging rodent infestation. Thank you for joining us. Please, Sarah took the only empty chair, naturally positioned at the far end of the table, as far from power as the room's geography allowed. Bradley began his presentation immediately, not wasting time on pleasantries. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address a serious threat to Mitchell Properties' stability and reputation. As you know, Robert Mitchell's will name Sarah Mitchell, he gestured toward her with barely concealed disdain, as owner of a substantial real estate portfolio currently valued at over $7 million. He clicked through a presentation on the screen behind him, charts showing property values, rental income, management complexity. Miss Mitchell has no business education, no property management experience, no understanding of commercial real estate beyond serving coffee in one of our buildings. Allowing her to control these assets puts millions of dollars at risk through inexperience, potential mismanagement, and frankly, the likelihood that she'll be manipulated by opportunists who recognize an easy mark. Several board members nodded. Sarah watched them catalog her appearance, the consignment store dress, the nervous hands, the waitress who'd wandered into a world she didn't understand. I propose we invoke the fiduciary responsibility clause, Bradley continued. Transfer portfolio management to a professional firm with proven expertise in commercial properties. Miss Mitchell would retain ownership on paper, but actual decision-making would be handled by people qualified to protect these assets. More nods. This was going exactly as Bradley had planned. Paint Sarah as incompetent. Offer a solution that conveniently benefited him. Let the board rubber stamp his takeover, while feeling responsible and prudent. Does Miss Mitchell have a response? The chairman's tone suggested he expected nothing worth hearing. Sarah stood slowly, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't begin with business credentials or property management experience. She began with a story. 8 months ago, I met an old man in a corner booth. He was wearing a corduroy jacket with holes in the elbows and shoes held together with duct tape. He couldn't afford coffee, couldn't afford breakfast. My coworkers called him the ghost and avoided serving him because he never tipped, never talked, just took up space during the breakfast rush. The room had gone quiet. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this is going. I brought him coffee anyway, black, exactly 190 degrees, because his hands shook and hotter would burn him. 2 slices of toast, cut diagonally, lightly buttered. I bought it for my own paycheck while I was drowning in medical debt and couldn't afford groceries. I shared my lunch with him 3 times a week and went hungry myself because I thought he needed it more. Sarah pulled out Robert's journal, holding it up so everyone could see. He was watching, documenting every gesture, every sacrifice, every moment when I chose kindness over convenience. He was testing me without my knowledge, measuring my character when I thought no one was paying attention. She opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Today, Sarah worked a double shift, then stayed an extra hour to help the night cook, whose daughter is sick. She's exhausted. She can barely afford groceries, but she still brought me lunch. Character isn't what we say, it's what we do when no one is watching, when it costs us something, when there's no reward expected. A few board members wouldn't meet her eyes now. They were seeing something they hadn't expected, not a gold digger or an opportunist, but someone who'd been genuinely kind to a stranger who appeared to have nothing. Robert didn't leave me these properties because I'm qualified, Sarah continued, addressing the room directly. He left them because I reminded him what matters. Not profit margins or quarterly reports. People. Sarah didn't sit back down. The momentum she'd built felt fragile, like glass that would shatter if she stopped moving. You want to talk about qualifications? She looked directly at Bradley. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about the boutique Veronica opened in 2019 that failed within 18 months. Robert bailed her out with $300,000 to cover her debts. That's documented here. She tapped the journal. Page 47. Veronica's face drained of color. Or we could discuss Marcus's gambling problem. The $538,000 Robert paid to cover his debts at 3 different casinos to prevent his credit from being destroyed. Page 93. Marcus wouldn't look up from a table. Or perhaps Bradley's embezzlement from the Portland subsidiary in 2021. $63,000 siphoned through false vendor invoices. Robert covered it personally and buried the evidence to protect the family name. Pages 112 through 115. The silence was absolute now. Every board member stared at the Mitchell family representatives with new understanding. These weren't responsible stewards of wealth. They were people who'd been repeatedly bailed out, whose failures had been covered, whose incompetence had been hidden by a man trying desperately to protect family reputation. He gave you millions, Sarah said, her voice stronger. Multiple times. Bailed you out, covered your mistakes, protected you from consequences. And how did you repay him? By avoiding him, by seeing him as an obligation, by making him eat alone in a diner, because none of you had time for a man who appeared to have nothing left to offer. Veronica found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than before. He was difficult, demanding. He pushed everyone away. He was lonely, Sarah corrected. He was testing you the same way he tested me, and you all failed. She pulled out the photographs next, spreading them across the conference table. Robert at the diner window. Robert hunched over his coffee. Robert looking at families with an expression that conveyed loneliness, so profound it had become physical. I'm not taking these properties to get rich. I'm taking them to honor the man who taught me that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve others. Sarah outlined her plan. The foundation in Robert's name, culinary scholarships for people buried under impossible circumstances, affordable housing initiatives in buildings she now owned, small business grants for dreamers who needed a chance. You're asking this board to trust me with $7 million in assets. I'm asking you to trust Robert's judgment. He spent 40 years building this company. He spent 8 months testing me. He decided I was worthy, and he was a smarter businessman than anyone in this room. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Then Thomas Brennan spoke. He was the oldest board member, maybe 80, with white hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of business deals and family drama. I knew Robert for 40 years, watched him build this company from nothing, helped him navigate the worst periods, losing Elizabeth, losing Diana, becoming isolated and bitter. He stood slowly, joints creaking with age. In his final years, I barely recognized him. The man who believed business should serve community had become cynical, calculating, convinced that genuine kindness no longer existed. But these words, he gestured to Sarah's presentation. This plan, this is the Robert, the first remember. The one who believed wealth was a tool for building something that mattered. Thomas extended his hand for a vote. I support Miss Mitchell's stewardship of these properties. Robert chose her deliberately. I trust his judgment more than my own reservations. One by one, other board members stood. Not all Veronica's allies remained seated, loyal to old money and established power. But enough, more than enough. The vote passed, 7-4. Sarah had won. The meeting adjourned with the formal efficiency of people eager to escape uncomfortable situations. Board members fled toward elevators and coffee and anywhere that wasn't this conference room where Waitress had exposed family secrets and won anyway. Sarah gathered her materials with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Victory felt different than she'd imagined. Less triumphant, more exhausting. Like she climbed a mountain only to discover another peak waiting beyond it. Veronica caught her in the hallway before she reached the elevator. You think you won? Her composure had cracked completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath the designer suit and diamond armor. You're nobody. A waitress playing dress-up in our family's legacy. You'll fail. You'll lose everything within 2 years, and we'll be there to pick up the pieces. Sarah met her anger without flinching. I'm his granddaughter, and I loved him enough to share my lunch when he had nothing to give me in return. That's more than you ever did." Veronica's hand rose as if to strike, then trembled and dropped. Years of breeding and social conditioning wouldn't allow her to actually hit someone in a corporate hallway, no matter how badly she wanted to. Marcus appeared, gently pulling his mother away. "Ma, let it go. We lost." But he lingered after Veronica stalked toward the elevator, close enough that his words reached only Sarah. "He talked about you." Near the end, when he could still speak clearly, said you had his daughter's kindness, that he'd finally found Elizabeth again after 40 years. Marcus's voice was soft, almost wondering. I think maybe he was right to choose you. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, their grandfather had seen something they'd missed. Sarah watched them leave, Veronica's fury and Marcus's reluctant acceptance, and felt not triumph, but profound exhaustion. This wasn't the victory she'd wanted. She'd wanted her grandfather alive, wanted the chance to know him as family instead of test, wanted years of Sunday dinners and shared stories instead of 8 months of coffee and toast before the revelation. But she'd honor what he gave her the only way she knew how, by being the person he believed she was, even when doubt whispered that she wasn't qualified, wasn't ready, wasn't enough. 6 months later, Rosie's diner had been transformed. The renovations had taken 3 months and cost more than Sarah's entire lifetime earnings before the inheritance. New commercial refrigerator that actually maintained temperature. Ventilation system that didn't wheeze. Flooring that wasn't cracked. Fresh paint brightening walls that had absorbed decades of grease and despair. But Sarah had insisted on preserving the vinyl booths. They'd been reupholstered, repaired properly instead of patched with duct tape. But the same booths remained in the same positions. History mattered. The place where her grandfather had sat mattered. The corner booth farthest from the door, his booth, had been fitted with a small brass plaque, reserved for those who need a kind word and a hot cup of coffee. Sarah kept it empty and available. Anyone who sat there received their meal for free, no questions asked. Homeless veterans, single mothers counting change, students skipping meals to afford textbooks. They found their way to that booth and discovered that someone had noticed them, that their hunger mattered, that kindness still existed without calculation. The staff had changed too. Brian still managed the floor, but now he smiled occasionally. Monica still complained, but her complaints had shifted from impossible working conditions to minor grievances that felt almost affectionate. New hires brought fresh energy, drawn by fair wages and benefits and the rumor that Rosie's had become the kind of place that actually cared about its employees. Sarah enrolled in culinary school part-time, balancing classes with managing the diner and overseeing the property portfolio. The other buildings generated enough rental income that she'd converted 2 of them into affordable housing, units rented at below-market rates to people who needed a chance more than they needed to maximize profit margins. The Mitchell Foundation had awarded its first round of scholarships in Robert's name. 12 students received full funding for culinary school, trade programs, or community college. 12 dreamers who'd been buried under impossible circumstances now had a path forward. Sarah still worked shifts at the diner sometimes. Not because she had to. She could afford to hire someone else, could delegate and disappear into the life wealthy people lived. But she chose to stay because it reminded her where she came from, what mattered, who she'd been when her grandfather had decided she was worth testing. The transformation was complete, but it hadn't made her unrecognizable. Sarah Mitchell was still Sarah Mitchell, just with resources that matched her character instead of limiting it. One morning, almost a year after Robert's death, Sarah arrived at Rosie's at exactly 6:45. The diner was quiet this early. The breakfast rush wouldn't start for another hour. Pale light filtered through windows that had been professionally cleaned, but still carried the same view of the parking lot. The same perspective her grandfather had studied for 8 months, while appearing to have nothing. Sarah made coffee the way she'd learned. Black, precisely 190 degrees. Tested with the thermometer she still carried in her apron out of habit. She cut 2 slices of toast diagonally, buttered them lightly, and carried both to the corner booth. The brass plaque gleamed softly, reserved for those who need a kind word and a hot cup of coffee. She sat in his seat, the vinyl cool through her jeans, and looked out at the parking lot as sunrise painted the asphalt gold. Dust motes danced in the light, visible only because the angle was perfect, the moment precise. Sarah thought about the old man who'd tested her, who'd searched 40 years for his daughter and found his granddaughter instead, who'd given her not just wealth but purpose, not just money but meaning, who'd taught her that the smallest acts mattered when no one was watching, when kindness cost everything, when grace expected nothing in return. She thought about her mother, barely remembered, but apparently kind enough that her character had crossed generations. Elizabeth Mitchell, who died believing her father had abandoned her, never knowing he'd spent 4 decades searching. And she thought about the greatest lesson Robert had taught without speaking it directly, that we never know who's watching, never know whose life might change because we chose kindness over convenience, grace over indifference, seeing people over ignoring them. The door chimed. Sarah looked up to see a young man entering hesitantly. Early 20s, probably homeless from the worn backpack and layers of clothing that suggested sleeping outside. He hovered near the door, clearly uncertain whether he belonged in a place that looked clean and warm and welcoming. Coffee, Sarah called out. Breakfast. He nodded, surprised that anyone had noticed him. Sarah poured him a cup, plated up eggs, and toast with the same care she'd once shown a stranger in a corner booth. She slid them across the counter. On the house, his gratitude was visible, transforming his face from wary to wondering. As he ate, Sarah returned to the corner booth and looked out the window at the neighborhood she now helped steward, at the city full of invisible people waiting for someone to notice them, at the parking lot where her grandfather had sat for 8 months, testing her character while pretending to have nothing. She understood now why he'd done it, why he'd hidden his wealth in worn, threadbare jackets and nursed cold coffee while watching her choose kindness when it cost everything. Because kindness without expectation was the rarest thing in a world that calculated return on every investment. Because grace under impossible pressure revealed character that comfort never could. Because the person you were when no one was watching was the only person that actually mattered. Sarah finished her coffee and stood to start her day. There was work to do. Foundations to run, scholarships to award, properties to manage, people to serve. The kingdom her grandfather had left her wouldn't run itself. But first, she'd make sure the young man eating breakfast had enough, would ask if he needed help, offer resources without judgment, see him as human rather than invisible. Because everyone deserved to be noticed. Everyone deserved kindness. Everyone deserved the chance to matter. And Sarah Mitchell, waitress turned property owner, granddaughter found after 40 years of searching, was going to spend the rest of her life proving that her grandfather's faith in her character hadn't been misplaced. One cup of coffee at a time. The greatest investments we make aren't measured in dollars or property deeds. They're measured in moments. The coffee poured for someone who can't afford it. The lunch shared when you're hungry yourself. The kindness offered when it costs everything and expects nothing in return. We never know who's watching. Never know whose life might change because we chose grace over indifference, because we saw someone the world had decided was invisible, because we believed that people mattered more than profit. Robert Mitchell taught his granddaughter that lesson not with words, but with presence. 8 months of observation while pretending to have nothing, measuring her character against a standard she didn't know existed. And when he'd seen enough, when he'd witnessed kindness that couldn't be faked and grace that cost her everything, he'd given her a kingdom disguised as a diner. Now Sarah teaches that same lesson every day, 1 cup of coffee at a time, to a world that desperately needs to remember. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves kindness. Everyone deserves the chance to matter. The question isn't whether you have wealth to share. The question is whether you have character to reveal when no one's watching, when it costs you something, when no reward is expected. Because somewhere someone might be testing you. And you'll never know until the results are revealed. If you believe kindness still matters, subscribe now. Because stories like this remind us who want me.